Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 4 of this free real estate school, our community real estate school. I wanted to welcome you guys. I want to say thank you so much for joining me this morning. This has not just been a rapid part of your transformation in deciding to get into real estate, it's been a rapid part of my transformational growth in deciding to teach real estate school. So I'm really grateful to everyone who's decided to join me on this journey. If you want to get a little bit more involved with real estate school, with our community, with other agents across the country, feel free to log in to our Miracle Morning for Real Estate Agents every morning at 6 o'clock a.m. on Clubhouse. I can tell you, starting my day with intentionality is changing my life. If you want to change your life, change your day. And if you want to change your day, change your morning. This morning I got up, I got going. I started with all of these fine people here, right over here, and it was an awesome way to start my morning. They've been encouraging me to jump in and take a cold shower. I was not excited about it, but I did. I took the cold shower. It got me into like this mindset of just like feeling awake, feeling alive. And I had breakfast with my kids, did some laundry, hung out with everybody, and then I get a chance to come in and start the day with you guys. So this is very exciting for me. So if you guys want to take it to the next level, this sort of massive accountability group that we've got going, where I'm teaching real estate school to adults at 9 a.m., real estate school to high school students at 4 o'clock p.m., and then I'm starting my day at 6 a.m., 5:30 before the call. And if you want to do that with me, start changing your life, change your day, change your morning. Okay, this is day 4 of real estate school. We're going to jump into chapter 13 of the Real Estate Principles book. And that is going to be property-related charges. Chapter 14, which is selling agent and buyer. Chapter 15, condition of property. Chapter 16, environmental hazards. Chapter 17, natural hazard disclosure. Chapter 18, lead-based paint disclosure. And then don't worry about knocking out the homework before tomorrow. What we're going to do is we're actually going to watch the video during class so that you really understand the Finder program, how you can earn commission as you learn, so that we knock out all of these questions during class before engaging in our Socratic discussion. So for those of you who have been watching this recorded later, I would suggest jumping on our Friday discussions live so that you can actually get the most out of it. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Tomorrow, like I said, we're going to walk through enrolling at CalPaces. So I'm actually going to walk you through the website. We're going to log into calpaces.com. I'm going to show you the left-hand side where you enter in the discount code 6106 for 30% off, which means the total cost of $102.55. Like I've said before, if you can't afford the $102.55, don't let that exclude you from this program. There is a scholarship program available. Our scholarship director is Rosie Rodriguez. So that being said, if you can pay the $102.55, that's great. It doesn't come to us. It goes to First Tuesday through CalPaces, and then get you signed up so you can get those 3 certificates, mail off to take your state exam. And then we're going to watch the Finder Referrals and Limitations video, which is part 1 of this introduction to the Finder program before jumping in on Monday and learning about Commission Bootcamp, which starts on January 25th, Monday. Immediately following this class, you guys will be able to jump in to Commission Bootcamp with Amy Serpa, Zach Bach, Andres De Arence, and several other agents have said that they're going to start participating as well. Sky Vasquez has mentioned he's going to be here. We're going to see Cora on Friday. So there's a lot of people that are interested in participating, interested in mentoring. If you're one of them, feel free to come in or open up your laptop. And then we're going to jump into this live Socratic discussion. A Socratic discussion is me asking you a question, and then us all thinking objectively about it. It is, why did you decide to get into real estate? So without further ado, like we say, it is time to jump into the boring stuff. We're going to grind together, and I'm going to do all this painful stuff with you. Oh, that's my phone number there. That's okay. All right, chapter 13, property-related charges. Okay. Sold as is a prohibited disclaimer. Property is sold as disclosed. A broker and their sales agent are to disclose the physical nature and condition of a property when first providing property information to individuals interested in making an offer to purchase. Thus, brokers and agents have a duty to timely disclose to all parties involved in a real estate transaction any significant physical aspects of a property that may affect the property's market value or the buyer's decision to purchase. A broker has a general duty to all parties in any type of sales transaction to disclose to buyers at the earliest possible moment of their awareness of any property defects. The duty to disclose known conditions on 1 to 4 unit residential properties requires the seller's broker to provide prospective buyers or their agents with the seller's transfer disclosure statement. Oh, that's my first text message of the day, reminding me to put my phone on airplane mode. But hey, at least my wife is text messaging and saying that she loves me and not like saying, I hate you, get lost, don't come back or whatever. All right, so that's that. We're back on airplane mode. You're probably not going to read any more of my text messages. Here we go. To be effective, property disclosures, including the transfer disclosure statement, are to be provided to the buyer as soon as practicable, meaning as soon as possible, upon the commencement of negotiations and prior to making an offer. If the disclosures are not timely made, the buyer may cancel the offer on discovery of the broker's failure to disclose prior to the buyer entering into a purchase agreement with the seller, or close escrow on the purchase and seek recovery of the cost to cure the untimely disclosures of known defects. Any attempt to have the buyer of a 1 to 4 unit residential property waive their right to the mandated property disclosure statement is unenforceable. Prohibidabito. All property conditions disclosed. For example, a broker is aware the seller's residence fails to conform to building and zoning regulations. The defect, if known to a buyer, would likely affect the price they're willing to pay. The defect is more commonly known as a material fact. The broker knows the buyer who is interested in making an offer is not aware of the violations and might reconsider the price they're willing to pay for the property if they learn of the violations. The broker decides not to disclose their knowledge of the defect. In an attempt to cover the omission, the broker writes "as is" in the disclaimer into the purchase agreement. The "as is" provision states the buyer accepts the property in its current as-is condition. After the buyer acquires the property, the city refuses to provide the utility services to the residents due to the building and zoning violations. The buyer demands their money losses from the broker, claiming the broker breached the general agency due to disclosed conditions of the property known to the broker before the buyer agreed to purchase. The broker claims the buyer waived their right to collect money damages when they sign the purchase agreement with the as-is disclaimer. Does an as-is disclaimer shield the broker from liability for the buyer's losses caused by the building and zoning violations? No. The seller's broker has a general duty owed to all parties to a transaction. The general duty requires the seller's broker to disclose all property conditions known or ought to have been known to the seller's broker due to their mandated inspections that affect the value and marketability of the property. The duty is not excused by writing "as-is" disclaimer into the purchase agreement in lieu of making the factual disclosures before an agreement is entered into with the seller. No coverage under the statute of limitations. Consider a buyer who makes an offer to purchase a residence. The seller's broker is aware of a large structural crack in the foundation of the residence that is not apparent on visual inspection. The broker delivers a TDS to the buyer's agent, who in turn hands it to the buyer, stating the residence has no defective conditions. Based on its report, the buyer acquires their property. More than 2 years later, the buyer discovers the crack. The buyer claims the broker is liable for the cost of repairing the foundation since the broker failed to disclose the crack. The broker claims the buyer's action is barred by the 2-year statute of limitations for misrepresentation since the broker only owed the buyer the statutory duty to disclose defects, which would be revealed by visual inspection. Is the broker liable to the buyer for intentionally misrepresenting the existence of the crack known to the broker in spite of the 2-year statute of limitations for negligent representations? Yes. The buyer's claim is not time barred under statutes requiring the broker to visually inspect and disclose observable defective property conditions. Liability is imposed on the broker for their intentional misrepresentation by omission of their actual knowledge of a condition of the property not readily visible when they stated defective conditions did not exist in the seller's TDS. Real estate size and boundaries will be accurately represented. Consider a broker who is the exclusive agent of a buyer in the purchase of a 1 to 4 unit residential property. Without first receiving a survey or title report to verify their representations, the broker advises their buyer about the amount of acreage and the extent of an easement on the property. The buyer enters into the purchase agreement and acquires the property in reliance of the broker's verbal representation about the size easement on the property. A further approval contingency, calling for the buyers to confirm the representation, is not included in the purchase agreement. Really quick, there are a couple of different kinds of easements, and we're not going to get too out in the woods on this, but the main one that I would be talking about right here, so there are properties where you cannot access your property, your acreage, from the main road without driving through another person's property. That's a lot of times is covered through an easement. But we can't take these easements for granted. We can't assume that they exist. And so you need to get title pulled. You need to get these plot maps figured out and make sure that, of course, everything that was represented to your buyer actually is what is being sold to your buyer. So all of that said, I wanted to make sure that you guys understood what an easement was. And it's, that's one of the many ways in which what an easement covers, excuse me. More than 2 years after closing, the buyer discovers the acreage and easement representations made by the broker are false. The property was worth less than paid. The buyer seeks to recover the difference in property value from the broker. The broker claims the buyer's recovery is barred by a 2-year statute of limitations for breach of a broker's agency duty to inspect and disclose defects on 1 to 4 unit residential properties. The buyer claims their action is not time barred since the 2-year statute of limitations only applies to negligent misrepresentations, not to the recovery of a loss caused by a broker's intentional misrepresentations about facts related to the property's physical condition. Is the buyer entitled to recovery of their loss and property value? Yes. The broker intentionally misrepresented the property size easement without first confirming what they consisted of. The 2-year statute of limitation only applies to a broker who inspects the property and, as a result of the inspection, negligently fails to disclose the facts that a reasonably diligent on-site inspection would have revealed. Here, the broker made representations as fact without verifying the information, nor did the broker advise the buyer of their source of information, and that information was not verified. Thus, a 3-year statute of limitations for intentional misrepresentation applies commencing on the date the buyer discovers the falsity of the broker's representation. Disclosure of potential and future use. A broker and their agents need to accurately represent title restrictions, potential use, and any conditions, covenants, and restrictions controlling real estate to prospective buyer or tenant. Further, a broker's duty to disclose a known potential future use of a property extends beyond disclosure of title and zoning conditions. For example, a buyer is interested in purchasing undeveloped property for commercial development. The property is located next to a maintenance yard owned by the state. The seller's broker has been previously contacted by the state regarding its intent to someday acquire the property to expand the maintenance yard through condemnation, also known as eminent domain. During purchase negotiations, the buyer asked the seller's broker if the state's interested in the property. The seller's broker informs the buyer the state has no interest in acquiring the property. The buyer enters into a purchase agreement with the seller. During the escrow, the buyer has plans drawn, obtains the necessary permits for development and construction of the property. Just before escrow closes, the buyer discovers the state intends to acquire the property through condemnation. The buyer proceeds to take title to the property and later grants the property to the state in condemnation proceeding. Here, the seller's broker is liable for the out-of-pocket losses incurred by the buyer for their loss of use of the property. The broker is liable for punitive damages for the intentional failure to disclose the state's interest in acquiring the property. The buyer relied on the broker's information regarding the state's activity when they determined whether the property was suitable for their future development plans. So it is on you as a buyer, as an agent, to make sure that the property is being used the way that it's being represented. It helps to have a good title guy. It helps to have access to some good websites to go ahead and pull all this information. The difficult thing is a lot of agents will not, and intentionally will not, put what a property is zoned for in their property description, in the MLS description, in the zoning, because they don't want to be held liable. So if you end up in a situation where you're out buying land for commercial use and you're looking for land that's zoned Ag 10, Agriculture 10 or R10 or R5 or RR, if you're looking for a house and you want to build a guest house, you have to make sure that the property that your clients are acquiring, that they're actually going to be able to use it for that. And then furthermore, the process of an eminent domain is garbage. You could look into the way that the state has really abused their eminent domain privileges in condemnation by looking at examples like Bruce's Beach. If you look at Bruce's Beach, which I believe is in Manhattan Beach, you'll see that a black family, an African-American family, acquired a beach. They were attempted to be rousted out of town through the Ku Klux Klan in Southern California. When that didn't work, the city council got involved. They condemned the property through eminent domain. So, and now there is a marker in Bruce's Beach dedicated to the Bruce family that states just that. So anyway, moving on, you can't always trust government to do the right thing, so you have to make sure that you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's for your clients. Marketability disclosure, anyway, moving on. I could really go off on some tangents. Like those of you that don't know I'm autistic, this is one of those examples where I'm like, all right, squirrel, keep focusing, Serpa. A broker and their agents need to advise a prospective buyer or tenant of any known material facts that may affect the value or desirability of the purchased or rented property. Four categories of conditions contribute to or detract from the value of property: physical conditions of soil and improvements, land use and title conditions, operating income and expenses, and location hazards and surrounding area impact. For example, a buyer seeks property for investment purposes. The broker recommends an apartment complex as the source of spendable income and equity buildup for the buyer. The broker analyzes the suitability of the income property, which is for sale, by preparing an annual property operating data sheet and reviewing it with the buyer. However, the property's scheduled rental income is represented to be far greater than the actual income. Additionally, the broker represents the property is in excellent physical condition. However, the property requires extensive renovation due to deferred maintenance. The broker makes these representations based on information received from the seller. The broker does not investigate the maintenance, expense, and income records of the property to check the accuracy of the seller's representations. Further, the broker does not advise the buyer the seller is the source of the property information. At the urging of the seller, the buyer is dissuaded from inspecting the property by the broker. Relying solely on the broker's representations as the operating income and conditions of the property, the buyer purchases the property. After closing, the buyer realizes that the operating income is far less than the scheduled income stated on the property operating statement. The buyer discovers tenants are delinquent in payment of rent and incurs extensive deferred maintenance expenses. These conditions collectively reduce the projected net spendable income and, in turn, the property's market value. Eventually, the buyer defaults and loses the property in foreclosure. This is an APOD, an annual property operating data sheet. This is kind of breaks down what you could expect for people who are new to becoming landlords and looking for investment property. Yeah, all right. A broker marketing property as an income-producing investment owes a duty to a buyer to research and disclose whether the property produces adequate income to meet expenses. Alternatively, the broker may include a contingency provision in the purchase agreement calling for the buyer to confirm representations or cancel the agreement prior to closing. Brokers cannot merely pass on statements made by the seller as the property's condition and income and expenses generated by the property without first reviewing them for apparent inaccuracies. When property information is passed on to others, the broker needs to advise them about the source of the information and any known need for further investigation into their accuracy. Thus, the broker is liable to the buyer for the buyer's lost property value. So this is what the seller told the agent. This is what they told me. And now take this with a grain of salt. This is coming directly from the seller. The seller said this. And then that way, you're not taking responsibility for the misrepresentation because the seller is putting on their greasy, car salesman hat and then trying to sling their house instead of actually talking about the truth. So you need to do your further due diligence on behalf of your clients. Verifying representations from others. A broker to 1 to 4 unit residential property is relieved of responsibility of verifying the representations regarding property conditions they receive from others and pass on to buyers as long as the source of information is disclosed to the buyer. The source of information is typically the seller's broker, or a home inspector. Further, the broker only has a duty to inspect and disclose material facts observable or known to them, not to independently verify the claims of their disclosure source. Okay, for those of you that are watching on Zoom, feel free to ask any questions as they come up. Christian Tikis is interpreting live. The interpretation button is on the bottom in the middle. Feel free to click on that and select the Spanish button if you need that translation service. And then we will continue to move forward here with Chapter 14. A seller's agent and the prospective buyer's agent. General duty to voluntarily disclose. A seller's broker and their agents have a special fiduciary agency duty owed solely to the seller who has employed the broker to diligently market the listed property for sale. The objective of this employment is to locate a prospective buyer who is ready, willing, and able to acquire the property on the listed terms. On locating a prospective buyer, either directly or through a buyer's agent, the seller's agent owes a prospective buyer, and thus also the buyer's agent, a limited, non-client general duty to voluntarily provide critical factual information on the listed property, collectively called disclosures of material facts. What is limited about the duty is not the extent or the detail to which the seller's agent may go to provide information, but the minimal quantity of fundamental information and data about the listed property which the seller's agent will hand to the prospective buyer or the buyer's agent before the seller's agent enters into a purchase agreement. The information disclosed by the seller's agent needs only to be sufficient enough in its content to place the buyer on a notice of facts which may have an adverse effect on the property's value or interfere with the buyer's intended use. Transparency as public policy objective. In California, public policy pursuit of transparency in property information sellers and buyers. The disclosures obligations of the seller's agent to voluntarily inform prospective buyers about the fundamentals of the Listed Property Act to eliminate asymmetry and power relationships in sales transactions. The seller's agent may not deliver up the less than minimum level of information to put the buyer on notice of the property's fundamental affecting value, give unfounded opinions or deceptive responses in response to inquiries, or stifle inquiries about the property in vigorous pursuit of the best financial advantage possible for the seller or the seller's broker. Gathering facts on adverse features. The methods for gathering adverse facts about a property's fundamental characteristics, as well as facts which enhance value, require the seller's agent to actively take steps to make specific disclosures when marketing a 1 to 4 unit residential property for sale. Actions which include conducting a visual inspection of the property, observe conditions which might adversely affect the market value of the property, and then enter into any observations of adverse conditions on the seller's prepared transfer disclosure statement, also known as the condition of property disclosure, if not already noted on the TDS by the seller, or an inconsistency with the seller's disclosures, whether or not a home inspector's report has or will be reviewed by the seller. Assuring seller compliance with the seller's duty to deliver statements to prospective buyers as soon as possible by providing the seller with statutory forms at the listing stage to be filled out, signed by the seller, and returned to the agent for inclusion in the marketing package to be handed to prospective buyers on their inquiry into additional property information. Reviewing and confirming, without further investigation or verification by the seller's agent. that all information and data on the disclosure documents received from the seller are consistent with information and data known to the seller's agent. Advising the seller on risk avoidance procedures by recommending the seller obtain third-party inspections of the property's condition and its components, roof, plumbing, septic, water, etc., to reduce the exposure to claims by a buyer who might discover deficiencies in the property not known to the seller or the seller's agent, and responding to the inquiries by the prospective buyer or buyer's agent into conditions relating to any aspect of the property with a full and fair answer of related facts known to the seller's agent which are of or might be considered detrimental to the value of the property. The pass-through of filtered information. A seller's agent's statutory duty owed to the prospective buyers to disclose facts about the integrity of physical condition of a listed 1 to 4 unit residential property is limited to prior knowledge about the property and the observations made while conducting the mandatory visual inspection. To complete the disclosure process, the seller's agent serves as a conduit through which the property information provided by the seller is filtered before the seller's agent passes it to the prospective buyer. Accordingly, all property information received from the seller is reviewed by the seller's agent for any inaccuracies or untruthful statements known or suspected to exist by the seller's agent. Corrections or contrary statements by the seller's agent necessary to set the information straight are included in the document or the document corrected before the information may be used to market the property and induce prospective buyers to make an offer to acquire the property. The extent to which disclosures about the physical condition of the property will be made is best demonstrated by what the seller's agent is not obligated to disclose. All facts adversely affecting value and known to the seller's agent will be disclosed, brought to the attention of the prospective buyers at the earliest opportunity. On the other hand, buyer's agents need to understand that the seller's agents have no duty to investigate any information or data disclosed as provided by the seller. The seller's agents need not to make an effort to authenticate its accuracy or truthfulness before passing it on to the prospective buyer. However, as a minimum effort to be made before handling prospective buyers' information received from the seller's agent is to review the information received from the seller, and include comments about the agent's actual knowledge and observations made during the visual inspection of the property which expose the inaccuracies, inconsistencies, false nature of omissions in the seller's statement, and identify the source of information as the seller. The dumb agent rule for single-family residences. That's a fun named rule. The seller's agent on a 1 to 4 unit residential property owes no affirmative duty to a prospective buyer to gather or voluntarily provide the prospect with any facts unknown to the seller's agent about the property's title conditions, the operating expenses for the property, and any tenant income the buyer will experience during ownership. The zoning or other use restrictions which may affect the buyer's future use of the property, except for the existence of industrial zoning which affects the property in nearby military ordnance locations. The income tax aspects of the buyer's acquisition, the suitability of the property based on the facts disclosed to actually meet the buyer's objectives in the acquisition, and information or data on any mixed use of the property. Respond fully and fairly. However, when asked by the prospective buyer or a buyer's agent about any aspect, feature, or condition which relates to the property or the transaction in some way, the seller's agent is duty-bound to respond fully and fairly to the inquiry. The response includes material facts known to the seller's agent about the subject matter of the inquiry and is free of half-truths and misleading statements. Conversely, it is the buyer or the buyer's agent who has the duty to care for and protect the buyer's best interest in the purchase of the property. The buyer's agent, not the seller's agent, is to determine what due diligence efforts are necessary to earn the extent to which the facts disclosed by the seller's agent interfere with the buyer's expectations for the use and enjoyment of the property before allowing the buyer to make the decisions to purchase or close escrow. In response to an inquiry, a seller's agent on a 1 to 4 unit residential property owes no duty to a prospective buyer to address the existence, much less the nature, of an easement located on the listed property since they are public records. However, when the seller's agent responds to an inquiry by the prospective buyer by providing information on the easement, the seller's agent is to state fully and fairly, without deceptive or misleading wording, their knowledge of the easement. Further, the seller's agent needs to identify the source of the information if they have not confirmed its accuracy or correctness, or condition the response in such a way as to prevent the prospective buyer from justifying their reliance on the information without further investigation. The buyer's inquiry is entitled to a response based on the seller's agent working knowledge of the underlying facts or identification of the source of the information given. If the seller's agent lacks sufficient knowledge to comment, they're duty-bound to say so. Minimum level of disclosure. A seller's agent locating a prospective buyer for their client's 1 to 4 unit residential property owes a duty to the prospective buyer to conduct a reasonably diligent visual inspection of the property for defects which adversely affect the value of the listed property. On completing the inspection, the seller's agent is to note on the seller's transfer disclosure statement any defects observable or known to the seller's agent which are not already noted by the seller or are inconsistent with the seller's disclosures. The TDS is to be handed to the prospective buyer as soon as practicable. However, the visual inspection and investigation of a 1 to 4 unit residential property by the seller's agent and the disclosure of their knowledge and observations excludes other readily available information not already known to the seller's agent, such as knowledge that may be obtained by the inspection of areas reasonably and normally inaccessible to the broker, an investigation of off-site areas and areas surrounding the property, and the inquiry into or review of public records or permits concerning the title or use of the property. However, the minimum disclosure rule for the seller's agent does not apply to a buyer's broker or agents, much less the buyer's agent's duty to fully and fairly inform and advise on what investigations the buyers ought to undertake. Common law duty. Further, the minimum 1 to 4 unit inspection and reporting requirements imposed on the seller's agent excludes the common law duty still imposed on seller's agents and other types of property to further investigate and disclose to buyers or sellers any material facts the agent discovers regarding title conditions, the financial consequences of owning the property, such as the property's operating cost, or the tax aspects of the transaction, seller only. The 1 to 4 unit disclosure limitation on seller's agents serves to set a minimum level of information and data to be disclosed to the buyer and the buyer's agent on notice of physical defects in the property which are observable or known to the seller or the seller's brokers and their agents. All right, moving on. Chapter 15, condition of property, the seller's disclosures. We're reading through 131 today. Whatever we don't get to will be homework. Mandated, and of course, like we always talk about, these tests are open book, so if you don't read every single word now, just make sure that you read it or get to studying it or get into a good study group like the Real Estate Exam Study Group with Stuart Jacobson before taking that test so that you don't brain dump everything. Okay, mandated on 1 to 4 unit residential units. Let me wet my whistle here a little bit. The seller of a 1 to 4 unit residential property completes and delivers to prospective buyers a statutory form called the Transfer Disclosure Statement, or TDS, more generically called the Condition of Property Disclosure Statement. We talked about this a little bit earlier. The seller's mandated use of the Transfer Disclosure Statement use is to be prepared with honesty and in good faith, whether or not a seller's agent is retained to review its content. Okay, so this is the condition of property, and it just, not only do they put things that went wrong, like maybe oh, there's a little mark here on the screen. Oh, that's not from, okay. So not only do they put the things that went wrong, but they also put like any improvements that they made to the property here. And so this is an important form. More and more agents are actually loading this onto the MLS, and then that people are actually just downloading it when they go check out the property. Okay, when preparing the TDS, the seller sets forth any property defects known as suspected to exist by the seller, any conditions known to the seller which might negatively affect the value and desirability of the property for a prospective buyer are to be disclosed, even though they may not an item listed on the TDS. Disclosures to the buyer are not limited to conditions pre-printed for the comment on the form. Disclose, disclose, disclose. You never want to end up in a situation where you didn't disclose and it comes back to haunt you. Also, the buyer cannot waive delivery of the statutorily mandated TDS. Any attempted waiver, such as an as-is provision to the purchase agreement, is void and is against public policy. That's more of the TDS. Delivery of the disclosure statement. While it is the seller who prepares the TDS is delivered to the buyer by the agent who directly received the purchase agreement offer from the buyer. The failure of the seller or any agent involved to deliver the seller's TDS to the buyer will not invalidate a sales transaction after it is closed. However, the seller and the seller's broker are both liable for the actual monetary losses incurred by the buyer due to an undisclosed defect known to them. The TDS is handed to the buyer before the seller accepts the purchase agreement offer submitted by a buyer. If the TDS is delivered to the buyer after the seller enters into a purchase agreement, the delivery is untimely and in violation of TDS rules, and the buyer may cancel the purchase agreement on discovery of undisclosed defects known to the seller or the seller's agent and unknown and observed by the buyer or the buyer's agent prior to acceptance, make a demand on the seller to correct the defects or reduce the price according to or before escrow closes, or close escrow and make a demand on the seller for the cost to cure the defects. Buyer's right to cancel on delayed disclosure. The transfer disclosure statement is to be delivered to the prospective buyer as soon as practicable on commencement of negotiations, as with the delivery of the natural disclosure statement, which has been dictated by the California Attorney General to be delivered ASAP. The TDS is to be delivered before entry into a purchase agreement. If the TDS is belated delivery to the buyer after the buyer and seller enter into a purchase agreement, the buyer may elect to cancel the purchase agreement under a statutory 3-day right to cancel. The buyer's statutory cancellation right runs for 3 days following the day the TDS is actually handed to the buyer, 5 days if delivered by mail. Demand to cure an undisclosed material defect. As an alternative remedy to canceling the purchase agreement on receipt of the unacceptable TDS, the buyer may make a demand on the seller to cure any undisclosed material defect affecting value known to the seller or to the seller's agent prior to entering into the purchase agreement. If the seller's agent knew or is charged with knowledge of the undisclosed defects at the time the buyer and the seller entered into the purchase agreement, the buyer's demand to cure the material defect may also be on the seller's agent. If the sellers will not voluntarily cure the defects on the demand, the buyer may close escrow and recover the costs incurred or valuation loss to correct the defect without concern for the purchase agreement contingency provision, stating the alternative statutory right to cancel the transaction. Defects known and disclosed or inaccurately disclosed by the seller or the seller's agent at the time the seller accepts the buyer's purchase offer impose liability on those who knew or are charged with knowledge. Another alternative for the buyer is to perform on the purchase agreement by tendering a price reduced by the cost to repair or replace the defects known to the seller and untimely disclosed or discovered by the buyer while under contract. Include a home inspector. Absolutely, your client's dad is not a home inspector. Your client's uncle or mom or best friend or nephew or whatever is not a home inspector. You need to have a real home inspector walk through that house. A competent seller's agent will aggressively recommend the seller retain a home inspector before they market the property. The inspector hired will conduct a physical examination of the property to determine the condition of its component parts. On the home inspector's completion of their examination, a home inspector's report will be prepared on their observation and findings, which is forwarded to the seller's agent. A home inspector often detects and reports property defects overlooked by the seller and not observed during the visual inspection by the seller's agent. Significant defects, which remain undisclosed at the time of the buyer goes under contract, tend to surface during escrow or after closing as claims against the seller's broker for deceit. A home inspector troubleshoots for defects not observed or observable to the seller's agent's eye. To greatly reduce the potential of buyer claims and eliminate the extent possible the risk of negligent property improvement disclosures. The home inspection report was coupled with preparation of the seller's transfer disclosure statement. Both are presented to the buyers before the seller accepts an offer. What the book is suggesting is that the seller maintains their own home inspection in order to prepare the home for listing. That way they can decide what they're going to fix before getting the house ready for the market to accompany the agent's AVID or agent visual inspection disclosure. Mandatory inspection by the seller's broker. A seller's agent or seller's broker is obligated to personally carry out the competent visual inspection of the property. The seller's disclosures and defects noted in the HIR are entered onto the TDS and reviewed by the seller's agent for discrepancies. The seller's agent then adds any information about their knowledge of material defects which have gone undisclosed by the seller or home inspector. A buyer who has 2 years from the close of escrow to pursue their seller's broker and the agent to recover losses caused by the broker or the agent's negligent failure to disclose observable known defects affecting the property's physical conditions and value. Undisclosed and unknown defects permitting recovery are those observable by a reasonably competent broker during a visual on-site inspection. A seller's agent is expected to be as a component as their broker in an inspection. However, the buyer will be able to recover their losses from the seller's broker if the seller's broker or an agent inspected the property and would not have observed the defect and did not actually know it existed. Following their mandatory visual inspection, the seller's agent or broker needs to make disclosures on the seller's transfer disclosure statement in full reliance on specific items covered in a home inspector's report the seller obtained on the property. If the HIR, home inspection report, is relied on after the seller's agent property inspection when preparing the TDS, and the TDS is later contested by the buyers as incorrect or inadequate in a claim on the broker and their agent are entitled to indemnification, held harmless from the home inspection company issuing the report. Controlled and exempt sellers. Unless a seller is exempt, sellers to a 1 to 4 unit residential real estates are required to fill out and furnish buyers with the statutory TDS when entering into a purchase agreement. Transactions which exempt the seller, but not the seller's agent, from preparing the delivery and statutory transfer disclosure statement to the buyers include transfers by court order, such as probate, eminent domain, or bankruptcy, by judicial foreclosures or trustee sale, on the resale of real estate owned property acquired by a lender, on a deed in lieu of foreclosure or by foreclosure, from co-owner to co-owner, from parent to child, from spouse to spouse, including property settlements resulting from a dissolution of a marriage, by tax sale, by reversion of unclaimed property to the state, and from or to any government agency. The best property disclosure tool for an exempt seller is the preparation and delivery of the statutory TDS form and property inspection report to prospective buyers or buyers' agents on every type of transaction. If the transaction is exempt or concerns property other than the 1 to 4 unit residentials units, the form as a practical matter needs to be used. Chapter 15. Now, even if a seller were to send you a home inspection report and you were representing the buyer, I would still definitely suggest getting your own home inspection. Chapter 16, environmental hazards and annoyances. Noxious man-made hazards. Environmental hazards are noxious or annoying conditions which are man-made hazards, not natural hazards. As environmental hazards, the conditions are classified as either injurious to health of humans or an interference with an individual's sensitivities. In further analysis, environmental hazards which affect the occupant and use and enjoyment of the property are either located on the property or originate from sources located elsewhere. Hazards on the property. Environmental hazards located on the property which pose a direct health threat on occupant due to construction materials, the design of the construction, the soil or its location include asbestos containing building materials and products used for insulation, fire protection, and the strengthening of materials, formaldehyde used in the composition of construction materials, radon gas concentrations in enclosed, unventilated spaces located within buildings where the underlying rock contains uranium, hazardous waste from materials, products, or substances which are toxic, corrosive, ignitable, or reactive. Toxic mold, smoke from the combustion of materials, products, supplies, or substances located on or within the building. Security bars, which might interfere with an occupant's ability to exit a room in order to avoid another hazard, such as a fire, and lead. Environmental hazards located off the property, but which have had an adverse effect on the use of a property due to noise, vibrations, odors, or some other ability to inflict harm, include military ordnance sites within 1 mile of the property, industrial zones, industrial zoning in the neighborhood of the property, airport influence areas establishing by local airport land commissions, and ground transportation. Well, let's see, and ground transportation arteries, which include train tracks and major highways in close proximity to the property. The effect on value and desirability. It's a good thing I started my day with a cold shower with that Miracle Morning. I'll tell you that much, because stuff like this gets me a little bit sleepy, and I have to do a lot of it. For those of you that are just actually hopping onto the call, we are starting the Miracle Morning every day at 6 a.m. On Clubhouse. I encourage you to join us at 6 a.m. to start your day with us if you want to. And then, like we said, next week we're starting Commission Boot Camp, starting at 10 o'clock immediately following the class. There we go. Let's go ahead and let's keep reading here. We're on page 106, and we're reading to page 131 today. The effect on value and desirability. Environmental hazards have an adverse effect on a property's value and desirability. Thus, they are considered defects which, if known, are disclosed as material facts. The hazards might affect a prospective buyer's decision to purchase the property. The disclosure to prospective buyers of environmental hazards related to a property known to a seller and seller's agent is required on the sale, exchange, or lease of types of property. While the disclosure of environmental hazards is the obligation of the seller, it is the seller's agent who has the agency, duty, care, or protection owed to the seller to place them in compliance with the environmental hazard disclosure requirements. There are a lot of things that are going to show up on a natural hazard disclosure. I live in French Valley, so just above my area there's a big dam. So we're naturally in a flood zone. There are noise hazards like the French Valley Airport right next to us. And so some people think that that's a hindrance. Myself, I love living next to the airport. A lot of my kids, their first words were airplane. So disclose. When I lived in Glendale, I lived near some train tracks, and I used to love listening to the trains at night. So it just really kind of depends on the person. Just make sure that people know. Here next to Camp Pendleton, there is a lot of explosive ordnance going off at night, and some people that is annoying and obnoxious. You see people posting about it online. Other people, it doesn't tend to bother them. Main roads, things like that. Things that are considered noise pollution. Visual inspection for hazards. Further, and more critically, the seller's agent also has an additional, more limited duty owed to the prospective buyers of the listed property. The seller's agent, on taking a listing, will personally conduct a visual inspection of the property for environmental hazards as well as physical defects, and do so with a level of competence equal to that of their broker. In turn, the seller's agent uses a transfer disclosure statement form to advise a prospective buyer of their observations and knowledge about conditions which constitute environmental hazards. To conclude, the seller's agent's disclosure of environmental hazards and eliminate any further duty to advise the prospective buyer about the environmental hazards, the seller's agent delivers or confirms the buyer's agent has delivered a copy of the environmental hazard booklet approved by the California Department of Health and Safety to the buyer. Delivery of the booklet is confirmed in writing through provision in the purchase agreement. However, the seller's agent might be subjected to an inquiry by either the prospective buyer or the buyer's agent about environmental hazards on or about the property. Here, the seller's agent is duty-bound to respond fully and honestly to the inquiry. Method of disclosure. The notice of any environmental hazard to be delivered to the buyer and by a seller is delivered in writing. No special form exists for giving the buyer notice of environmental hazards as is provided for natural hazards. Until the real estate industry or a legislator develops one, The TDS and the purchase agreement are currently used as the vehicles for written delivery. The TDS is delivered at the time the prospective buyer inquires further about a listed property. A counteroffer may be needed to make the additional disclosures covered by a purchase agreement provisions. Some environmental hazards are itemized in the TDS, such as direct reference to hazardous construction materials and waste, window security bars and release mechanisms, and an indirect reference to environmental noise. All other known environmental hazards are added by separate itemization in the TDS. Well, that's our 5-minute warning for class. We got started a couple minutes late here, so I'm going to read for 5 minutes before I jump into the questions to try to give you guys as little bit of homework as possible. All other known environmental hazards are added by the separate itemization in the TDS. As for environmental hazards emanating from off-site locations, they're disclosed through provisions in the purchase agreement since they are typically known to the buyer's agent who are familiar with the area. Editor's note: an environmental hazard booklet is not a disclosure of known defects on the property. The booklet merely contains a general information on a few environmental hazards. Blah, 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 blah. Regardless of the method of delivery, the seller's agent is to give the environmental hazard disclosure to the prospective buyers as soon as practicable, meaning as soon as reasonably possible, but not saying exactly that, as with the disclosure of natural hazards. The legislator intended for the environmental hazard disclosures to be made prior to entry of a purchase agreement. Need and motivation for disclosure. For the seller's agent to properly anticipate the need to have the disclosures available to deliver to prospective buyers, the effort to promptly gather the information from the seller begins at the moment the listing is solicited and entered into. The seller and the seller's agent have numerous good reasons to fully comply at the earliest moment with the environmental hazard disclosure, as well as with all other property-related disclosures. The benefits of a full disclosure up front and before the seller accepts an offer or makes a counteroffer include the prevention of delays in closing, the avoidance of cancellations on discovery under due diligences, investigation and contingencies, the elimination of likely renegotiations over price or offsets for corrective costs due to the seller's agent's dilatory disclosure or the buyer's discovery during escrow, the shortening of time needed for the buyer to complete their due diligence investigation, and control by the seller of remedial costs and responsibilities by terms included in the purchase agreement, not by later offset or demands by the buyer or a court. Inquiries documented. The seller's agent needs to document in writing for the agent's file only the agent's inquiry of the seller about environmental hazards which are known or may be known to the seller. The agent's list is to itemize all the environmental hazards which might possibly exist on or about a property and the construction materials which contain them, the age or date of construction to elicit a review of probable hazards, construction materials used at the time of construction, and information known about the property or disclosures that the seller received when the seller purchased the property or were brought to the seller's attention on any renovation of the property. Also, the seller's agent's inquiry into hazardous material ought to precede the seller's preparation of the TDS. Thus, the seller is mentally prepared to release information about the knowledge of defects in the condition on the property. Finally, the seller's agent's visual inspection needs to be conducted before the seller prepares the TDS so the observations may be discussed. The seller has no obligation to hire an expert to investigate and report on whether or not the environmental hazard is present on or about the property. The seller is not obligated to remove, eliminate, or mitigate an environmental hazard unless the seller becomes obligated under the terms of the purchase agreement with the buyer. It is the seller and the seller's agent's knowledge about the property which is disclosed on the TDS. The off-site environmental hazards which affect the use of the property are generally well known by the buyer's agent for inclusion in the purchase agreement. If not included in the TDS or the purchase agreement, or counteroffer by the seller is necessary to disclose as soon as possible. The seller and the seller's agent's knowledge of the environmental hazard disclosure both on and off the property. Okay, at this point we're going to start wrapping up here. The reading for today, in order to stay on task with reading the book, and of course, like I said, the first 5 weeks are the most reading intensive. a lot of days we have 45 to 60 pages of reading a day. Today is no exception. So we've got to read to page 131 if we want to keep up with our 5-week course. And so formaldehyde, radon gas, hazardous waste on site, mold, the rogue, and the vogue, chapter 16 summary, chapter 17. So you're going to be reading all the way to chapter 131. So natural hazard disclosures by the seller's agent. And then keep going and going. Look at all this reading that you guys get to do. Chapter 18, lead-based paint disclosures. And is that it? Is chapter 18 the last chapter? No. Yep, that is the last chapter. Okay, and then what we'll do is we will pick up on chapter 19 on Monday. There is no reading tomorrow. Tomorrow is our, I'll go ahead and I'll tell you guys what's happening tomorrow. So let me go ahead and switch this right here and go back over these notes. Tomorrow is day 5. That was day 4. We're going to enroll at calpaces.com. That way you guys are enrolled in the real estate school and can legally start working as a finder, which means that you can start earning commission. You cannot participate in commission bootcamp until you are enrolled in real estate school. We're going to watch the finder referrals and limitations video on Vimeo by First Tuesday, which is going to break down what you can and cannot do. And then we're going to jump into a live Socratic discussion about why you got into real estate. And then on Monday, we're going to, so if anyone has any questions on the Zoom, feel free to do that. On Monday, we're going to have our next round of special guest instructors. So let me go ahead and show you what that's going to look like. Let's see, that's Commission Bootcamp for you guys, which is day 6. So next week is a big week for you guys. Week number 2 is Commission Bootcamp. And then what will happen is on day 8, I think it's day 8 of the program, we really go over all the legalities of what all of this looks like. But on Monday, you guys get to start work. So if you have been unemployed, underemployed, if you're looking to start work, Monday is the day. We're going to go ahead and turn this thing on. Let me go and see if there are any questions on Facebook. We got a good morning from Tom. Thank you for tuning in, Tom. We've got a good morning from Amy. Amy, every morning is on the Zoom call with me. She also has made it a point to every Friday she's going to be running an accountability group, making sure that everybody is staying up to pace with everything. So feel free to reach out to Amy if you have any questions, if you feel like you missed anything or whatnot. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to wrap this guy up, unless anybody has any questions. Anybody in the Zoom group have any questions? 3, 6, 9, 10. We got 10 people on Zoom. Anybody? Okay. Christian Tikas, thank you very much for translating this class live into Spanish, my brother. Thank you for doing that. You're a good man. Thank you guys for joining us on this Thursday. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys tomorrow, where we jump into what the Finder program is. And then on Monday, when we talk to you about how to generate the leads so that you can send that business out and start getting paid. We got a question. Where can I find the recordings? Okay, thank you for asking, Gavin. I'll go ahead and I'll let you guys know right now. You guys can find these recordings on our YouTube channel, on our community news, which is our channel. You can find them on our Facebook page, which is Educate, Empower, Explore California. www.facebook.com/Educate, Empower, Explore California. So if you missed a class, feel free to check into Facebook, check into YouTube, and then if you have not yet logged into a class and you're curious as to how this works and what it is that we're doing, feel free to reach out to Amy about how you could log into Zoom. That's where we've got more people participating live, and we also have our Spanish translation. So if you do need the Spanish access, that also is Zoom exclusive. It is something that has to be recorded. We do have a huge network on this back end on Zoom, so feel free to jump in and visit with us, and we'll go ahead and we'll let you guys benefit from all this different stuff. Let me go and check to see if there are any more questions in the Zoom before we kick this pig, call it a day. What is the YouTube channel called? It's our community. I think it's just called Our Community. Our Community News is what yeah, thanks, Amy. Our Community News is what the YouTube channel is called. And these, I load them every single day. immediately after the class ends, so that if you happen to miss the class and you want to stay up to date on everything that's going on, you can do that right away. And then also, one other thing, Fridays are good to log into live because that's when we're doing the guided Socratic discussion. So what will happen is I'll do about 20, 25 minutes of teaching, and then we're going to jump on and actually start talking about our careers. Amy was just sharing what our community news looks like on the Zoom. If you check out her screen right now, so you can see we're loading several videos a day where we're loading both the adult classes and the high school classes every single day. Okay, at this point I'm going to end it. I'm going to say everybody have a great Thursday. I'll see you tomorrow for day 5 of real estate school, and everyone have an excellent day. Bye, everybody. Oh, another question? Is the sulfur smell in San Jacinto considered an environmental hazard? Good night. Christian Tikis, is the sulfur smell in San Jacinto considered an environmental hazard? I don't think so, right? So like there are places that in Central California where it smells like farm country, right? And you just I'm not going to say that out loud, Amy. So like, I'm not going to make fun of any of these cities here, but there are some places that they have a smell, they have an aroma. I would imagine that that would not necessarily be something that would be a bad thing to disclose, especially for people that are moving into the area from out of area. But I can't imagine that it would be something that would get you into some trouble if you did not disclose. Okay, thank you for bringing my attention to that question, Amy. Christian Tikis, he said it's more of a nuisance than a hazard. A hazard is something that is more of like a health issue. So like, let's say that there was raw sewage, like and you were being exposed to that scent, then that would be something that would definitely cause an issue. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to type our YouTube channel. Actually, I can type our Facebook channel right here into the group chat. That way you can just have the direct link. There you go. Educate and Empower Explore, California. So that link will take you directly to the Facebook page right there. So feel free to copy that down. Check us out on Facebook. Check us out on YouTube. All the things. Subscribe and like and smashing the buttons and whatever the kids are doing. And then we'll see you guys tomorrow. Everybody have a great rest of your Thursday. See you on Friday. Bye, guys. Adios, Facebook.